Welcome to Third and Fairfax, the official podcast of the Writers Guild of America West. I'm your host, Brian Gary. On this episode, with the 2024 elections just a few weeks away, the campaign season is in full swing. WGA West Senior Research and Public Policy Director Laura Blum-Smith joins Kristina Woo, and the two talk about the WGA West's policy priorities for this cycle. Here's Kristina.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us on Third and Fairfax. Thank you for being here. Let's just jump right in. I'm really excited to hear about what you do here and what our policy priorities are. First, though, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into policy? How did you come to work at the WGA?
Absolutely. So I joined the WGA in 2013 as a researcher, which includes, as I'll talk about more, working to, carry out the policy program. So at that point, I started working on the Guild's anti-consolidation agenda. I worked on our opposition to a bunch of mergers, including the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger, the AT&T Time Warner Inc. merger. So after a few years of that, I took over as the director of the department in 2018.
Wow. Congratulations. When you say that you were here as a researcher, can you just say more about that? Just, obviously a union has a lot of people that work here, a lot of people that do a lot of different things. Just tell us more about what your department does and kind of what you do to support it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Research and Public Policy Department is sort of charged with understanding what are the pressures on writer compensation, on writer power, and writer leverage. So that includes, on sort of the research side, understanding what's going on in the industry, what are the trends in writer compensation and employment that we need to be thinking about, how can we support writers in individual negotiations and collective negotiations. We do a lot of support for when we're in bargaining, all of the sort of, state of the industry reports and things like that. The piece of communicating to members that our companies have enough money for our demands, is based on our ongoing understanding of, what is going on out there in the business. And then on the policy side, it's, sort of with that understanding that we have of the pressures on writers, what are the policy, political, legislative levers to try to tackle those? So, always it's the big picture question for the Guild is how can we build power for writers and increase their leverage? And this program, the policy program, it was developed after the 2007 strike, which obviously was about the rise of the internet. And it was clear at that time that the internet was a very important space that would be impacted by, federal policy and law. And so we look at that and we think, okay, how can we counter the power and control that just a few companies have over this industry? So our work, which I'll talk more about later on sort of pro-competition policy, including fighting for net neutrality rules, including our antitrust work, really sort of flowed from that.
But it also kind of sounds like you are at the front lines of alerting the people who do make policy in this country of shifts in technology and how that's affecting capitalism, how that's affecting workers. Do you feel like there's a lot of, educating that you have to do on behalf of writers to lawmakers to help them understand not only what maybe some of the unintended consequences of new technology is, and also maybe even a step back, explaining to them why new technology needs to be regulated?
Absolutely. And I think it's what you're speaking to here is this issue of how can policy, which is often very abstract, be made real to the people who are engaged in the creation or maintenance of policy, to legislators and government agencies and things like that. And so, telling the story of writers is incredibly powerful. You are all professional storytellers. So for example, I think, antitrust is a policy area that can feel very technical, theoretical, dense, and jargony. And what we've been able to do, what writers have been able to do, is explain to policymakers and antitrust enforcers and legislators, like, this is what it looks like when there's no competition or when there's inadequate competition. And that's something where, like, the strike was extremely powerful. I think it connected the story, a story that we have been telling in our policy work for a long time about a lack of competition in media. It connected that to something visible and visceral for, audiences of, government employees around the country as well, that, like, when you have so little competition among employers that they can be non-responsive to the concerns of their workers, when those workers are raising concerns about, this shift in technology is meaning that the employer has been able to take advantage of that to decrease my compensation, to prevent me from sharing in the success of the business. This is what you get, a 148-day strike.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to me, it's also so impactful because when you talk about something like antitrust, you're not just talking about our own industry. This is something that affects all industries. So that does feel quite exciting that you're sort of like at the front lines of sort of, I don't know if you could ever balance the scales of like capitalism, but we're trying, I guess. We're talking about a little bit about antitrust, but what are the other like big policy areas that the WGA is focusing on?
Yeah, absolutely. So antitrust is sort of within the bucket of competition policy. So that includes opposing media consolidation and promoting broadband competition through net neutrality rules. Then another major category is sort of labor issues, which there I'm including legislation that impacts our health and pension plans, for instance. And then there's sort of policies that affect kind of the health of the industry, like copyright. Mm. And then, the big new one is, of course, AI.
Mm-hmm. I'm realizing I asked you that question, and I feel like maybe we should also like take a step back a little bit and just give a little bit more context for the work that you do here, and also, I guess, underscoring the fact that like does every union have a sort of policy arm? I know that like obviously corporations and like big business, like they have their own sort of policy apparatus, or they have ways of putting a thumb down on the scale. And so, yeah, can you just talk more about like how sort of normal this is amongst work that people do with regard to labor? Yeah,
absolutely. Many unions have political policy programs that do some similar things to what we do, because unions around the country are impacted by federal, state, local policy. What that can look like at different unions can be pretty different depending on what the environment that they're operating in is, what are the pressures on their membership. But there are, for instance, many other unions that are also engaged in antitrust work. Mm-hmm. So I want, just to throw out one great example, which is UFCW, which has done an incredible amount of work opposing the Kroger-Albertsons merger. Mm. And, it's sort of very similar. They're looking at an environment in which the consolidation of employers would significantly decrease worker leverage, union leverage. And so they're engaging in that space. Mm-hmm. So, it's a lot of unions are doing this kind of work. Our employers are certainly using their access to capital to, engage in advocacy to serve their own interests. And so it's important for us and for other unions to also be out there in that space telling the story of, why a given piece of policy or a given merger or whatever, what that really means for workers within the story of what it means for an industry or a company or things like that.
When you say telling the story of, does that mean you're talking to like state and federal lawmakers, explaining to them like sort of the worker perspective on these issues, and then trying to like get legislation written? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can look a lot of different ways, particularly because some of the issues that we're talking about, like they play out in a lot of different stages or arenas. So I'm to take maybe AI for an example, because that's one where the issue is extremely live and it's playing out in a bunch of different places. It's playing out legislatively and in the courts and in the industry in terms of how the technology is being sort of how it's developing, how it's being experimented with by our employers and others. And so what we do is we sort of look at the conversations that are ongoing and we look for opportunities to weigh in. So that could look like, for instance, a regulatory proceeding on a given topic. So in AI, the Biden administration directed government agencies to sort of engage on the topic of AI. And then a number of different agencies sort of opened proceedings to examine, well, what does this mean? So the U.S. Copyright Office engaged in an inquiry about AI and copyright. And the Writers Guild filed a comment. We also organized hundreds of members to file their own comments in that proceeding. And then what that's about is saying, like I keep using the words telling the story, but it is that. It's like you have a technology that is based on the theft of untold volumes of copyrighted material that these models have just stolen and used to create these large, plagiarism machines. And what does that mean for the creative workers in those industries? And, how do writers operate? How does the theft of your creative work have an impact? And it's sort of, it can be explaining things like in our collective bargaining agreement, we have these concepts of credit, of authorship, of rights in the work. It's not copyright. We don't hold copyright in the United States, but we have, through our collective bargaining agreement, copyright-like rights, like residuals, payment for reuse of the work. And so explaining to, this government agency how the AI model basically just chops off that chain of value. So that's, one environment. There's also talking directly to legislators. And for instance, again, to use the AI example, Congressman Schiff has a bill that would require all AIs to make transparent every piece of copyrighted material used to train the AI. So we supported that. We have conversations with them about, what is the issue from our perspective and what does it mean?
AI, I think, is probably the most sort of obvious area that needs to be sort of tracked, monitored, educated on. But how do you identify other areas that need to be addressed? Is it through, because I know whenever we have our MBA, there's a survey that goes out, and I hope all the members are filling out that survey. Are you learning about issues through that? Are you how are you gathering this intel?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're always paying attention to what are the members telling us about the pressures that they are experiencing. But also, I think a lot of this has sort of been developed. I mean, AI is the newest issue, right? So that's, we were not. Our policy program did not have a focus on AI 5 years ago. But a lot of it comes out of, our awareness of what are the things that writers value that we need to protect. So that sense of our understanding of the market in which writers are operating, our sense of, it is fundamentally problematic for writers to not have enough employers to sell to. That harms writer leverage. And so anything that we can do to encourage competition in the market for writers' work is something we want to support with the policy program. How can we support that? What are the available policy levers to support those things?
I think a question that is coming up as I listen to you talk too is it's very interesting to me to hear you speak on all these different areas that affect everyday life for people, not just writers, but for just like workers in general. I guess maybe this is more of just a comment than anything, but it is interesting that's like we need to have the government involved in regulating so much of the like worker landscape, because if not, then I don't know, I guess corporations could just do whatever they want. And I guess building on that concept, like I feel like the history of antitrust as it relates to entertainment has been kind of really up and down within the past. You probably know the dates better than me, but like, there used to be the Paramount Decree and like FinCEN and like all those things that now like don't exist. I guess maybe if you're able, can you sort of take us through maybe like a quick like history of like how those protections helped us in the past, why they were rescinded, and like now what we're doing to sort of get back to a place where we can be protected again? Because if we only have like 4 places to sell to, that's bad. If there's only like one kind of big amorphous blob of a company that like owns everything, that's like going to severely inhibit job creation. So can you sort of like contextualize this a little bit for us?
Absolutely. So the entertainment industry is, in its history, sort of has this perennial issue of companies trying to grab control of it through different mechanisms. So you named several of the sort of key historical instances of that. So we had movie studios try to use control and ownership of movie theaters to determine what viewers were able to see in what was then theatrical exhibition, the dominant market for content. Then you have broadcast networks try to use their control of distribution of content. At the time, the 3 networks were basically what there was. Use that very broad control to influence what content was being produced, what could be made and shown on those networks. And the government has historically been sort of concerned with those attempts to monopolize media in the form of, these breakup efforts. So the Paramount consent decrees were structural separation between the movie studios and the movie theaters in reaction to that attempt to monopolize. The FinCEN, which is short for the Financial Interest and Syndication rules, were similarly required that broadcast networks not own the programming that they distributed in prime time. And that opened up competition among producers of content. So those were, reactions of the government seeing companies are attempting to assert that control that violates antitrust law or various other sort of government rules about media markets. We're going to break that up. So those instances, of course, are some decades in the past. The FinCEN rules were more or less abandoned in the 90s. The Paramount consent decrees remained in effect, sort of had been gradually weakened, and then were finally completely overturned during the Trump administration. But the sort of backdrop to that shift is that for many decades there was sort of a turn away from aggressive antitrust enforcement. It became antitrust law, which remained completely on the books during this period. There was no actual change to, the underlying law. It just kind of became a little bit of a dead letter. And the government was sort of allowing many very harmful mergers, was not pursuing anti-competitive behavior of very powerful companies. And so, that's part of why we're in the environment that we're in right now, because, there was just a sort of stepping back from the exercise of really trying to go after concentrated economic power through antitrust law. But there started to be a shift, and I would say it's something that I've witnessed sort of during my time at the Guild, thinking back to, over the last decade, where there started to be a recognition that that the way we had been practicing, or rather not practicing, antitrust law had allowed incredibly harmful consolidation and accumulation of market power, and we needed to change something. And so particularly under the Biden administration, there has been a real shift in terms of how people are thinking about antitrust law and enforcement. And it's been extremely positive, where the government is going after more mergers, trying to block more mergers, trying to block them for better reasons. For instance, trying to block mergers because they would be bad for workers is something that was like unheard of for decades. And so we have really been, the Writers Guild and our policy program, I think, has really been a player in that shift. We've engaged in this space for a very long time. We have been kind of telling the narrative of the media industry as this like poster child for the failures of antitrust and the harm to writers and to the industry from consolidation. It's been very gratifying to see, it feels like there started to be a real shift. We would still very much like to see more action because, as you note, those historical examples of antitrust enforcement to sort of break up companies are all decades past. And now what we have is an environment that looks pretty similar to those that brought government action in the past, where we're fairly close to an environment in which there could be just 3 or 4 companies controlling most of content. And so we'd like to see more action from the government to sort of bring attention to the anti-competitive environment in media, something like, financial interest and syndication rules for streaming. So that's something that we have advocated for and are going to continue to advocate for.
I guess I'm also realizing too, now that I'm listening to you, obviously there's a lot of engagement with actual policymakers and legislation. Is there any, I guess our points of connection with our employers are when we are negotiating the MBA. Are there times when you all are sort of speaking to each other outside of negotiation time just to keep a line open about what these issues might be? Because I'm sure, how do I articulate this? And please excuse me, this is she went to school for movies. I did not go to school for economics or business.
I didn't either. It's fine.
Look at us. Every entity, whether it's a union or a corporation, we're looking out for our own. But is there any contact that you have with the companies about this stuff, or is it really only when we're renegotiating our MBA?
I would say that there are times in which our interests align with the companies in the context of policy. So one example is some of the healthcare advocacy that we've done, to sort of protect our health plan from harmful added costs or requirements. There was a tax on high-cost healthcare plans that was part of the Affordable Care Act that was then repealed just in the last few years. And that was something where, for instance, our employers were also opposed to this tax, So it's very much when there are opportunities, we can take advantage of them when we are aligned. I won't say that any of our employers have joined us in our opposition to their mergers.
Sure. I guess, though, to build on what you're saying about health and pension, can you just talk more about what you do and what sort of activity goes into sort of protecting that health and pension plan, building it up, and I guess protecting the fund?
Yes. So, and I'm going to take them a little bit separately because they're impacted by some different areas of policy and law. So pension plans are governed by laws that are related to making sure that they can pay out the obligations that they have incurred. Pension plans are meant to pay out over decades, right? This is a pension plan is about saying this is work that's happening, now you're going to retire in 30, 40 years. And the pension plan is making sure that it has the funds to pay that out in 30 or 40 years. So there are reporting requirements, there are funding requirements, and that's governed under federal law.
Okay.
And so our policy advocacy in that space has often been about trying to ensure that our very healthy pension plan is not burdened by costs or requirements targeted towards failing plans. So that's actually an area where we had a really big win on policy in 2021 with the passage of the American Rescue Plan, which included funding for some of the failing pension funds that basically averted a sort of worst-case scenario in which our healthy fund would have been targeted for added costs and requirements that were really, just meant for the failing funds. So that's sort of pension policy. And then healthcare policy. So our plan is governed by some federal laws, but also can benefit from some state laws because it's mostly, most of the covered individuals are in the state of California. That's where people are going to the doctor and things like that. So that's an area where, for instance, when I was talking earlier about like our opposition to that tax that was part of the Affordable Care Act, that was a federal law.
Okay.
So that engagement was federal. But then we've also done some policy advocacy at the state level because that's where our plan is like incurring costs. And so something that we think about a lot on the healthcare plan is, controlling costs. As do many healthcare plans around the country. So, for instance, our policy program supported the creation of the California Office of Healthcare Affordability, which is a state entity that sets cost targets for healthcare providers in the state. And this is all meant to be very targeted towards, like, when you think about healthcare costs, and here I'm just going to tie things back a little bit to antitrust, healthcare costs, broadly have risen a lot and very quickly in this country. And that's really because of concentrated market power on the supply side of healthcare. And so with our policy program, we're very sort of targeted towards that. That's the issue. So ways that we can support controlling costs that then our plan is able to take advantage of. That's a policy lever that supports the plan.
I see. Thank you for explaining that. I truly hope that I'm not the only person who
You're not.
didn't know any
You're
of
not.
that.
I promise.
How can WGA members kind of get involved in the work that you do? Obviously, I think a lot of us, have a vested interest in seeing our careers continue, and that is supported not in small part by this policy work that's being done. So how can members get more involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I talked earlier about how having writers speak their stories in the policy program is incredibly impactful. And I just, to give sort of a few examples of that, because we've brought writers to speak on many of these core issues, like before congressional committees and government agencies, joining for meetings with legislators. So just a couple examples, Chris Kaiser and Sean Ryan spoke before Senate committees on video competition and bad mergers. Adam Conover spoke at an FTC, Federal Trade Commission, listening session on competition. Writers Guild President Meredith Steam joined an AI Insight panel hosted by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in D.C. at the White House. We brought Judalina Nira and Tanya Sriracho to speak before the California legislature on underrepresentation of Latinas in Hollywood. And then, members have also weighed in with some of those government agencies directly. Like hundreds of members submitted comments to the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice when they were rewriting the merger guidelines. This was in 2023 during the strike. Hundreds of members submitted comments to the Copyright Office on AI and copyright. So all of that is so impactful because it makes tangible abstract policy issues. I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit here, but I think it can't be overemphasized how effective it is, to have a writer be able to articulate, this is what it really means for me to only have a few employers to sell to. This is what it means for my life and my career. So that is just an incredibly important part of our policy work that we will continue to utilize.
And I guess practically speaking, are you reaching out to members to help tell their stories? Do members approach you and, saying like, I have a story that I think needs telling? What's the mechanism? How do
all of the above.
Okay.
We certainly, if anybody, has an interest and just wants to get in touch with us, we're always happy to speak to folks. We've also done outreach. For instance, we did a round where we were trying to speak with folks who had experienced having their projects canceled in the wake of the Warner Discovery merger, which we then used to create a bulletin about, merger harms as illustrated by these very specific examples. And then when there's a sort of a formal comment opportunity, we'll email folks, do just a broad member email. So it's all of the above.
Great. Okay. I don't know. Is there anything else that you want to share about the program and the work that you do here that you think that you want to leave members with? Obviously, as many members as we can get involved, I think is helpful. But if there's anything else that you want to leave us with, I think members would really love to hear it.
So I think that this policy program, it's maybe helpful to understand it in the context. You asked earlier about like unions and their policy agendas and how they operate. And, we're a relatively small union in the context of the labor movement. Just compare us to like an SEIU or something like that. And we've been able to be really effective on the issues that we've engaged on. I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth emphasizing in the context of antitrust that we have really been a player in this extremely positive shift from a sort of, derelict, tired, lack of antitrust enforcement that wasn't concerned with workers, that didn't ask when two companies were buying each other. When this company is talking about, we're going to save $3 billion, how much of that is layoffs?
Right.
And that's just been, so that's been this, again, we're always like starved for positive political policy news, right? That's positive. That's tangible. And we have been able to play a role, and it's because of writers, because of, what they're able to communicate about that issue. So I hope that writers are interested in and take pride in this program because I think it's very effective.
Definitely. Thank you so much for being here with us. For anyone interested in wanting to get more involved with all this policy making, I think there's going to be a link in the show notes that you can check out to get in touch. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
It was great meeting you.
Yay.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Third and Fairfax. You can listen and subscribe to Third and Fairfax on Spotify, Apple, and Libsyn, and watch us on the Writers Guild of America West's YouTube channel. If you like this episode or have a comment, email us at podcast@wga.org. Also check out writtenby.com, the Guild's online publication, for more on writer craft, career, and union life. And see you next time.